Great Hera, Wonder Woman 84 blows chunks. Well, at least your movie didn't have Richard Pryor in it.
Coming to paperback and e-readers in 2021, John Haynes, Taking Care of Business. The man who rules the world breaks on a brand new partner to help him take care of business in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, Taking Care of Business in 2021 at online booksellers everywhere.
I was looking forward to Wonder Woman 1984 ever since the trailer dropped back in 2019. And back in 2019, I made plans to definitely go out here and buy a ticket to go see Wonder Woman 1984 in the theaters. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic closing all of the theaters here in New York, I had to go out here and spend $15 on a month of HBO Max to see Wonder Woman 1984. Now, I had high hopes for Wonder Woman 1984 when I saw the trailer, and I was hoping that the eventual film would be just as good. Unfortunately, while your Wonder Woman 1984 is true to a Wonder Woman comic of the 80s, it is true to a Wonder Woman comic of the 80s for all the wrong reasons. Now, your Wonder Woman comics back in the 80s, they were around the 300s at that period, and the books of that era were not the best books of the Wonder Woman run. I mean, the stories were really flat, the stories were really uninspired, and in many cases, a lot of them were a completely jumbled mess as related to storytelling, and many people wanted to see something really done to refresh the character, and many people were thankful when George Perez finally came around in, I think, 1986 or 1987, and finally managed to get the character back on track. And sadly, your Patty Jenkins Wonder Woman 1984 captures all of the worst elements of a 1984 Wonder Woman comic and brings them to life on the screen and gives us the Wonder Woman version of Superman 3 in this film. Now, your Superman 3 was one of the worst superhero movies ever to be made, and like Superman 3, Wonder Woman 84 doesn't know whether it wants to be an action movie, a romantic comedy, or a slapstick comedy, or an action-adventure movie. It just really doesn't know what it wants to be, and sadly, the film just does not have the same focus that Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman had in 2017 in the first two acts of that movie. No, this film just feels completely disjointed, completely uneven, and it just does not flow together and synergize the way the first Wonder Woman did for the first two acts, and it just does not really come together to form into a cohesive story that anybody could really follow or even more so care about. And that was one of the big problems with Wonder Woman 84. It was hard to care about this movie. I mean, this movie, it was going in so many different directions, and the character development really just wasn't there on the screen. I mean, Jeff Johns was one of the screenwriters along with two other people, and he really didn't do a good job of developing Diana's character to make us care about her, and he didn't really do a good job of developing any of the other characters to make them rich and multidimensional. Everybody in this film really felt like cardboard cut-out characters, and while the characters had a lot of flash to them, there really wasn't much substance to them to really make these characters resonate with you. And this film, it just, again, was just so with these one-dimensional characters and this absolutely jumbled mess of a story never really comes together to become something that you would really feel any sort of connection to. I mean, in the opening sequence, we get this beautiful sequence of young Diana on Paradise Island, and this sequence, it's one of the best sequences in the film. It shows how your young Diana is competing against all of these other Amazons, And she decides, as the sequence is going on, after she makes a mistake, to cheat. And as a result, she gets disqualified. And that whole sequence is supposed to set up the story. But when I look at as it related to the sequence, it's a great sequence, but it's not really the inciting incident to set the movie off and really draw you in. Yet it works as a sequence all by itself, and it's one of the best sequences in the film. Unfortunately, when you put it together with the rest of the film, because it moves us forward after that moment on Paradise Island with young Diana, with the lesson of this is what happens when you cheat and you lie, is that you lose, but it doesn't really flow into the later sequence of the film, which starts with Diana then going to this mall, and then she's taking on these robbers at this jewelry store, which is another fun sequence, but it just doesn't really flow well with the other sequence. And we have this scene where with her taking on these robbers of a jewelry store, and these robbers of a jewelry store doesn't really flow to fit with the rest of the movie. I mean, then we have this whole thing with this Max Lord being on television. Then we have your Barbara Minerva, who is conveniently hired to go work at the Smithsonian with Diana, who's one of the people running the Smithsonian. And then we get a plot point about some sort of stone, some sort of stone or some sort of element that they think is some sort of fake thing. And when I started talking about this wishing and stuff, I started to see where your Warner Brothers, they really just wanted to make Wonder Woman 84 into Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. And this knockoff Infinity Stone, this wishing stone, is like the DC version of the Infinity Gems. And this thing really does not really help the story, because just is like the Infinity Stones in and of themselves are a really weak plot device, as I see it, over at Marvel. And DC trying to copy Marvel's Infinity Stones with this wishing stone, it really does. It was really the point where the movie falls apart, because everybody is out here wishing for what they want, and because of this magical wish, as a result, Steve Trevor comes back to life in the form of another man's body. His soul and his essence come into another man's body, and this is the thing that motivates the broke Max Lord to go to this party at the Smithsonian and then try to steal this stone. Now, I don't want to really give away too many spoilers, because there are some people who want to still see this film, but this film is a completely hot mess of jumbled plot points, jumbled story points, and it just does not come together in an organic fashion, and all of the story elements just don't come together in a way that makes you look at this story and see it as anything that makes any sense. I mean, this whole movie, Wonder Woman 84, all of the elements of the story, they're just all over the place, and it seems like they were writing this as they were going along. I mean, to say that one of the best comic writers, Jeff Johns, is one of the screenwriters of this film, that's a real disappointment, because we know that Jeff can write better stories on a Flash comic or one of the other DC heroes, but in this screenplay, all of those elements just fall completely apart. I mean, the dialogue is not good in this movie. The action sequences, they're okay, but they're just by the numbers. And the attempts at humor and romance just don't come together, because we don't feel anything, because everything just is so disjointed and uneven. And this film, it is not up to the level of Patty Jenkins' previous films. I will give her credit that the cinematography was there and the acting was there and the special effects, they were okay, but this film just is not up to the standard of the 2017's first two acts of Wonder Woman. I mean, the first two acts of Wonder Woman in 2017 were absolutely perfect and practically just like a comic book come to life for all the good reasons. But Wonder Woman 84 is like a comic book from pre-crisis DC in the 80s for all the bad reasons. And all of the reasons people walked away from DC back in the 80s, with the exception of Firestorm and Teen Titans back in the early to mid 80s, were on that screen. And this is one of the reasons why we had to have Crisis of Infinite Earths, because many books like Wonder Woman in that era were just so terrible that nobody wanted to go out here and buy them. This is why we had the DC implosion in the late 70s, and it led to the Crisis of Infinite Earths in 85 or 86, I believe. And this book this movie is basically every reason why we had to have Crisis of Infinite Earths, because the storytelling back then was a completely jumbled mess, and it just did not fit cohesively with anything else, even in its own continuity. And that was apparent to me in some scenes where we had your Wonder Woman learning how to fly her invisible plane, which they messed that element up, where she's in the plane and she says she can turn things invisible. And I said, that's never been in a Wonder Woman comic I've ever read. And that's how they make the invisible jet, by this contrivance that they make in the story. And then we have Wonder Woman flying, which does not really fit into Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice, because in that movie we had Wonder Woman who couldn't fly, but in this movie, which takes place almost 30 years before, Wonder Woman is flying. So there's a lot of inconsistencies with the other movies of the DC cinematic universe here, but that's par for the course, because in DC's own continuity in the 80s, it was a complete and jumbled mess back then. And this movie, sadly, again, captures the spirit of everything bad about DC in 1984, and shows us everything bad about DC in 1984 at the time. I mean, this movie, in its attempts to try to be the Superman 2 of the Wonder Woman franchise, turns into Superman 3. And if you've ever seen Superman 3 with the late Christopher Reeve and the late Richard Pryor, you would see that it was one of the worst superhero movies ever made, because the Salkins at the time, what they wanted to do was inject more comedy into Superman movies, even though Superman 2 was a blockbuster because of its incredible action sequences between Superman and the three Kryptonians. People wanted more action like that, but your Salkins wanted to give people more humor, and that gave us the jumbled mess that was Superman 3. And with Wonder Woman 84, they follow the same path in trying to give us romantic comedy and more types of comedy, but it falls completely flat because most people really wanted to see action and adventure between Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor, and we didn't get to see that action and adventure with a little bit of romance. We got a whole bunch of other different ideas, and none of them come completely together to form a movie that flows organically. Now, there are other problems with Wonder Woman 84, in addition to the weak story that makes absolutely no sense, the one-dimensional character development, and the, as I see it, kind of bland and generic special effects and stunt sequences. And the thing that really annoyed me about Wonder Woman 84 was it was supposed to be set in 1984, but this film had so many errors to that time period. Now, I was 11 years old in 1984, and I can remember that year because that was the year that I think I graduated elementary school at CES 132, and I remember that year vividly because it was a major turning point in my life. And I remember 1984, and I remember many elements of 1984 that were not in that film. And I remember watching that mall sequence, and the first thing that popped out of my head was these kids had these tall cups of coffee, and I know for a fact that there were no tall cups of coffee in 1984 like we had at Starbucks. No, back then, most people here in New York, we drank 8 ounces of coffee out of these blue cups that usually said, "We are happy to serve you." And that's all people drank in the 1980s was small cups of coffee. Starbucks had not blown up yet to give us these tall cups of coffee, and that was a major error by the producers as related to details in the film. Another detail that irked me was a sequence where a guy tells Diana, "Oh, I can get you a 19-inch TV," but in 1984, 19-inch TVs were played out. I mean, 19-inch TVs were small back in 1984, and the standard for in 1984 for a color TV was a 25-inch TV. You either had a floor model or what was getting ready to come out in late 84, early 85, which was the tabletop color TV, tube TV, which was a major technological revolution because usually you could only get 25-inch screens in floor models like the Zenith System 3, and it was basically a piece of furniture. So most people who were making big money in 84, they had a floor model 25-inch TV or a 27-inch, which was considered the top of the line back then, but most people wanted 25, 27-inch TVs, and this guy's talking like, "Oh, I can get you a 19-inch TV like it's something," but in 1984, a 19-inch TV was considered nothing back then, just like a 13-inch TV was considered nothing back then. If you were a high roller and you were a big-time shot caller, you could get somebody a 25 or a 27-inch TV, and that was a blaring hole in that story because anybody who grew up during the 80s, we knew that was the case. And then there was a sequence again at the mall. In addition to those coffee cups, we had a sequence where they were playing Operation Wolf, and I'm sitting there going, Operation Wolf, didn't even come out until 87, and I know this because I used to go to this candy store that was not too far from IS 148, and my brother took me to the theater one time, and they had Operation Wolf going on at the movie theater, and in both cases, again, this was the 8-bit era of video games, and Operation Wolf was a major part of the 8-bit era, which came around the same time Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Master System were going on, because I had a Sega Master System back then, but they didn't make the cartridge out until about, I think, 88 or so, or 89, but the whole thing is, you've got kids playing a video game that did not even come out until 1987. So I looked at that and said, you have kids playing Operation Wolf, and Operation Wolf didn't come out. I'm like, you have $200 million for a budget, and you can't get a Karate Champ video game? I mean, Karate Champ came out in 84. And you could have had Ms. Pac-Man, you could have had Q*bert. Those machines are readily available. You could even get replicas at Walmart. But you have $200 million, and you miss out on little tiny details of the 80s, and they're glaring to somebody who grew up in the 80s. So instead of this film really being what I thought was going to be in the trailers, a love letter to the 80s, we got a lot of glaring errors about things that went on in the 80s. And there were things that really irked me, like when I saw cops driving 86 Caprices instead of driving 83 or 84 Caprices. I could look at, because I know my box Chevys, and the grills of an 86 Caprice is completely different than the grill of an 83 or 84 Caprice, or even, because it's like, I think it's 78 to about 80 they had the same grill. And then I know that the 83 to 85 Caprices had a different grill, and then the 86 to 1990 Caprices had a different grill, and I could identify a box Chevy by the grills, and I'm like, you guys are making numerous errors right here. And another glaring error to me was Diana stepping out of a Chrysler Fifth Avenue, because Chrysler cars were garbage back then, and I'm sitting there going, you have Diana stepping out of a Chrysler Fifth Avenue when most people considered the high-end luxury cars that people really wanted to buy were the Cadillac Fleetwood, or they would go out here and they would get the brand new Lincoln Town Car. Now, Lincoln Town Car, that was a respected ride, that Panther platform Lincoln Town Car. I'm like, again, $200 million, and you can't get an 84 Lincoln Town Car or a Cadillac Fleetwood, because there are plenty of guys out here in the lowrider scene and plenty of collectors who probably would have leased you that car for a couple of minutes in that scene. And again, $200 million, and I don't see it being spent on the screen on those small details that would make this movie really feel like an 80s movie and really have that energy of the 80s. And that's another thing I really didn't like about Wonder Woman 84, is that even though it's supposedly set in 1984, it doesn't feel like 1984. And it doesn't feel like 1984. It feels like one of my Facebook friends said, an 80s cosplay, because so many elements in this film are just absolutely wrong, and so many elements of this film just aren't there. It's like, on the surface, you have things like that mall where it's looking sort of like the 80s, but it doesn't have that feel. And it doesn't have that feel because that period, people who grew up in that period know that, yes, there was a Cold War going on, yes, there was stuff happening, but people had this sense of hope and optimism, and they had these aspirations to go out here and try to do better. But we really didn't get to feel that in the mood of the film, and that's one of the things that really is missing from this film, is that hopeful optimism from the Reagan period. And I also was really disappointed by the fact that they picked an actor who did not look like Ronald Reagan at all. I mean, this president, he looks absolutely nothing like Ronald Reagan, and that's another minus on this film, because again, all the details are just so jumbled in this film, and it's just like, again, somebody was not doing their research, and because they weren't doing their research, the whole story just falls apart because of the details. And that's something I know from my own personal experience, because when I was writing books like Isis, Imitation of Life, and Easting, The Sands of Time, I wanted to make sure I got the details right. And I would go out back here and I would check, like for Sands of Time, the part where John Haynes takes place in 1987, and I wanted to make sure every detail was right to 87. And I was 13 years old in 87, and I can remember that time somewhat vividly, but I still did my research to make sure certain things were correct to the time period. And the same thing when I was doing Spellbound, which is set in 89, but I didn't see that kind of care taking place with these sequences in 1984, and it was really, again, a disappointment to me, because I really wanted to see them, if they're going to make a 1984 movie, try to stay accurate to the period and try to stay accurate to the way people lived at that time. And this film did not really do a good job of staying accurate to 1984 and the lives people lived in 84. And the story itself just was, it was like a classic Bronze Age mess of a Wonder Woman story that we used to get in the issues in the 300s. I mean, that whole idea of this knockoff Infinity Stone, as I see it, where people are making wishes and people are getting stuff and then having to trade something in return, it just never really worked on screen. And the characters never really came to come to any sort of learning of a lesson about this. I mean, everybody was so one-dimensional in this movie, and the whole wishing plotline, it just completely crumbled in the dust, just like that knockoff Infinity Stone, and it just fell completely apart as it was going on screen. And the whole ending of the movie, that was just a major disappointment for me. And I have to say, this is one of the worst movies I have seen so far in the DC cinematic universe. I mean, Batman v Superman was disappointing like this, but I have to say 84 was even worse than Batman v Superman, because this movie, it just had all the elements that it could have been something had they just focused on one aspect of a story. But no, they tried to put all these different story points in a blender, try to blend them together. Unfortunately, they did not come together, and they just separated, and they became a complete mess. And this film was just a major disappointment all around. I mean, this film, I had such high hopes when I saw the trailer, but the end product was, as I see it, one of the worst superhero movies I ever saw. Because, again, it seems like Patty Jenkins wanted to make a Wonder Woman 84 movie based on 1984 Wonder Woman comics, but 1984 Wonder Woman comics just weren't good. And 1984 Wonder Woman comics were one of the reasons why Wonder Woman wasn't selling back then, and is one of the reasons why many people like myself were disappointed with DC Comics back then, because DC Comics only had, I think, 3 comics that were good back in the early to mid 80s. One was the New Teen Titans, the second was Fury of Firestorm, and the third was Batman and Batman. And I think I would give an honorable mention to another DC comic that was still good at the time in '84, and that was these are all the pre-crisis titles, because my brother had a lot of those in his collection, and the only good ones again were New Teen Titans, Firestorm, and Batman. And Detective Comics gets an honorable mention, but most of the other comics at DC were, like right now, absolutely awful. And sadly, what we got in Wonder Woman 84 was a crash course in how bad DC Comics was in the early to mid 80s, and showing us that there's not only a crisis going on with the comic division, but there's also a crisis with the cinematic division. And this series, sadly, needs a reboot to get us fresh stories for their films, and we need a reboot in creative talent, because this film just wasn't up to par, and we really need a reboot of the DC Cinematic Universe so we can get fantastic films like 2017's Wonder Woman, and that show us the best of DC Comics, and not films that show us the worst as related to DC Comics overall. And this movie was just was not really good. I mean, it just was a complete disappointment. And if I had to spend $15 at the theater, I believe that I would have been deeply disappointed in what I saw. And sadly, I was disappointed, because this film just was not good. And I know everybody here could do much better. Patty Jenkins could do much better than the slop that was here. Gal Gadot, Chris Pine, everybody could do better than what was here. And all of the problems, as I see it, really started with Jeff Johns and that terrible script, because this script really, it just showed really poor writing, poor execution, and not a really good understanding of the character or her story. And because this film felt like 50 different stories and was trying to be sort of like a run of comics, it just ran the entire film into the ground over the course of 2.5 hours. And I was, again, saddened that this I have to make this video, because I really wanted to come out here to tell people that Wonder Woman 84 was a great film. But what I saw on screen was one of the worst films I've ever seen since Superman 3. And this film reminded me so much of Superman 3 that if Warner Brothers doesn't get it together, their whole superhero franchise may be ending before it begins. Now, if you want to see me make more videos reviewing superhero movies like Wonder Woman 84, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to pick up my books that feature heroines like the Isis series, the E-Steam series, or the books of the Spinsterella trilogy or the Thetas, you can find all of those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.